We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming. I'm Chad Stebbins, Director of International Studies, and since this is a Canada semester presentation, we decided to recreate the conditions of frigid northern Quebec for today's presentation in the hopes that you will feel right at home. So I'm very pleased that we have such a speaker of considerable magnitude today to talk to us about Canadian food culture. Dr. Sylvain Charlebois is a professor in food distribution and policy in the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is one of the maritime provinces on the eastern edge of Canada. Dr. Charlebois is also the Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab, also located at Dalhousie University. He is known as the food professor. How appropriate. His career research interests lie in the broad areas of food distribution, security, and safety. He is one of the world's most cited scholars in food supply chain management, food value chain, and traceability, with more than 775 published peer-reviewed journal articles. 775. I could work 1,000 years and never begin to hit that number. Dr. Charlebois is also an editor for the prestigious Trends in Food Science Technology Journal. He co-hosts the Food Professor podcast, discussing issues in the food service, grocery, and restaurant industries. It boasts more listeners than any other Canadian management podcast in Canada. So again, I was delighted when Dr. Charlebois accepted our invitation to speak to us by Zoom from Nova Scotia. So let me go ahead and bring on Dr. Charlebois.
It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, although I would have preferred to be with you in person, but unfortunately it's impossible to do that, especially this week. We are starting our semester this week in Halifax, Canada, so it's a busy week indeed. I did accept the invitation very quickly because I think the topic is actually quite interesting, and frankly, it's always nice to hear that that nations abroad do talk about or want to better understand Canada. Canada is simple but yet complicated at the same time, especially for Americans. I do spend a lot of time in America, and often we tend to think that both nations are very similar. They're not really, although I would argue that America, because of its economy, influences Canada's economy for sure. Both economies are highly integrated, so it's quite normal to see some influences north of the border. In the agri-food sector, of course, there are major similarities, but there are also differences as well. And so this afternoon, during my talk, I'm hoping, of course, to cover the aspect of culture, food culture in Canada, but also because of my background in management and economics, I certainly would love to talk more about the economics of our food system in Canada, which is very different actually than in America, based on my own understanding, of course. I actually have been visiting professor in many different universities in America. I just actually last year spent 6 months at the University of South Florida in Tampa Bay, which was really lovely. Of course, the weather was much nicer than in Canada. Although right now in Canada, the weather is really nice, but I would say probably starting in November, you do want to move south as quickly as possible because it gets really, really cold, around probably 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And being in the East Coast, you guys are in the middle of the continent. In the East Coast, the North Atlantic is not very forgiving. Typically, we don't have a spring, so we tend to actually have frigid weather until probably May, end of April, May, so it's not the greatest time to be here anyways. So I'm going to, I have prepared a deck for you, which I will share right now, and hopefully you will see it as I post it. And let me see, hopefully you can see it now. So essentially, Canada's agri-food sector is diverse. Obviously, we export for about $85 billion worth of agri-food commodities. We do feed the world more than we feed ourselves in Canada. That's the reality of our sector. And of course, we tend to really optimize our growing season, which is very short compared to the U.S. or even Mexico. Our growing season obviously is from May to October, approximately, the main growing season, if you will. Of course, we do import a lot of food from the United States, about $30 billion worth of food, especially coming from Arizona and California. Our gardens are for the winter months. But essentially, Canada is heavily influenced. The way we live here, the way we feed ourselves, is immensely influenced by our climate. Of course, our northern climate. We do have a winter, and because of the winter itself, it is more challenging to feed ourselves during the winter. We've actually made it work over the centuries, of course, but it's much more difficult, more expensive to operate farms, to grow food in the winter. It's more expensive, obviously. There are more greenhouses, vertical farms in Canada, but that tends to cost more to produce food, of course. So in general, that's kind of what we see here in Canada. Let's start with, let me see here. I'm just going to, so there we are. Okay, so we have the full presentation here. So essentially, let's start with First Nations. First Nations obviously were here way before colonies came to Canada. Of course, the difference with the U.S. is that we had French colonies and English colonies coming to Canada, which formed our nation. And our nation is about 160 years old, so it's not that old. Our country is fairly young, but we have had actually First Nations, and First Nations really their heritage is actually quite strong. A lot of people today don't realize it, but we did inherit from First Nations in many ways. When you think of hunting, fishing, and agriculture, in a wintry context, because it was cold, because we are dealing with harsh weather, the indigenous actually allowed people coming from other nations to really understand how to survive, how to feed um, ourselves, basically getting the vitamins that we need with the little science that there was in those days, and vitamin C is certainly the big one. Uh, Back in the day, of course, a lot of people died from scorbut. I can't remember the name in English, but scorbut is really a vitamin C deficiency, and frankly, it really became a problem. And so the indigenous actually allowed us to work on to understand how to cope with that. The historical significance of First Nations is actually quite important. One example is maple syrup. I'm not sure how many of you actually know what maple syrup is. Um, you, America actually does produce some maple syrup, about 10% of the world production, mostly in Vermont, I believe, Vermont, New Hampshire, I believe, and perhaps Maine. And it comes from maple trees. It's the sap coming from maple trees that you boil, and then you end up with syrup. That came from First Nations. That's just one example of some of the commodities that we actually have in Canada that did come from First Nations back in the day. And of course, uh, the um, the continent was colonized by different nations, and in our case, it's France and England, of course, and of course that's when agriculture became more, I'd say, more efficient, if you will, both in livestock and with new crops. It became more organized. The sense of ownership was established, and scalability as well. Over time, we saw more farmers become professional farmers and making a living out of farming. And I guess it's the same thing in the U.S. But in Canada, again, it's a little bit more difficult when you actually have a very short growing season compared to other places around the world. But the colonization of Canada really led to using better instrument, better equipment, more plant science, more animal science as well, and that really made a big difference. And of course, the other issue, or the other thing that really happened in Canada is immigration and multiculturalism. In Canada, we tend to have many cultures and subcultures, and I don't want to spend this lecture talking about what a culture is, but essentially in Canada, they are dominating cultures, but the philosophy in Canada is to embrace differences, allowing other people to I guess allow their culture to flourish as much as possible, and that's why we have, well, many different restaurants, and the approach is very different. Instead of just blending in, it's actually the opposite. It's allowing people to have a different identity, if you will, using different languages and so on and so forth. This is really important when it comes to food because because of our history, defining what Canadian food culture is it's very difficult because there is no, I would say, dominating culture. And you'll see later on in the presentation, we don't necessarily, Canada is not well known for a very uh, influential dish that we find anywhere around the world, like the hamburger, or pizza, for example, or spaghetti or something like that. It's more subtle. It's a mixture of different cultures, and so there's not a whole lot of dishes that we're creating in Canada. There are some, but you'll see that they're not necessarily all that nutritious, to be honest, and that comes from our ideal of getting calories to survive the winter, I would say. And we're all about comfort food as much as possible because we want to. The Canadian way is often about making people feel comfortable, which comes from our attitude towards immigration and multiculturalism. So I would say that really in Canada, we actually have major communities that have actually opened up restaurants, and it's the same in America, but in Canada, I would say it's a little bit more dominant, I would say, because it's more part of the community. It's not just ethnic foods or a nice restaurant offering a different kind of cuisine. It's basically a cuisine. It's more established, if you will, compared to other parts of the world, which I think makes things interesting. So, because it allowed Canadians to discover different cuisines without a passport, essentially. And so, for example, in 2016, with the Syrian crisis, we actually accommodated, I believe, over 30,000 different Syrians in the Atlantic alone. And we now see many Syrian restaurants, Syrian chocolate factories, and so on and so forth, allowing Canadians to discover a new kind of cuisines. And of course, there's a new community that actually emerged from that, which is very different. The one thing that I notice sometimes when I travel in America is that often Americans don't appreciate that there are regions in Canada, and all regions are very different. My family and I had the pleasure to live in 4 different regions, and when you think about food, it's not the same from one region to another. So I'm in the Atlantic right now. I'm not from the Atlantic. I'm originally from Quebec. I'm French Canadian. But in the Atlantic here, it's all about seafood. and lobster and cod, but it's not institutionalized commercialism. So when people actually eat seafood, lobster and cod, they either catch it themselves or they buy these products off a parking lot or alongside the road. It's not common to see people from here to buy those kinds of food in a store or to eat them in a restaurant. Tourists will do that, of course, here. And of course, the industry here will actually ship most of its production overseas. So about 90% of everything that's produced in the Atlantic in seafood and lobster is actually exported. So the Atlantic really, and of course, 90% of everything that's consumed in Canada is actually imported as well. Numbers are similar in the U.S., but it's a really peculiar situation in the Atlantic. So when COVID hit, what was really interesting is that people noticed that retail sales for seafood, lobster, and cod never changed in the Atlantic, just because people just don't buy these products in a restaurant or in a retail store. So aquaculture, of course, is another dominant industry here, as well as in British Columbia as well. Quebec is basically the French-speaking part of Canada. It's about 20% of the population. It's about 9 million people. That's where I'm from personally, and of course, there are unique aspects of Quebec, like poutine, and I'll talk about poutine in a couple of minutes. I actually wrote a book about poutine, and I'll tell you more about it. It's actually there's more to it than just the folkloric aspect of poutine. If you don't know what poutine is, I'll explain to you what it is later. But there's a unique story behind poutine, which is now a well-known dish. It's actually probably one of the most well-known Canadian dishes in the world now. Maple syrup is well known. And the dairy sector in Canada, we have a thing called supply management, which again is unique to Canada compared to the US. And and I'll explain to you more about supply management later, but because it's a complicated scheme, but it really kind of points to the culture of Canada around protectionism, around how America's economy is seen as a threat to Canada because we are 41 million people. America is the most dominating economy in the world. And so, obviously, because we're just north of America, we have seen many policies that has a protectionist tone to them over the years. Um, and of course, the Québécois agri-food sector is actually quite developed. In fact, 60% of all commodities grown in Quebec are processed in the province as well, which tells you a lot about how things work in Quebec versus other places around the world, around the country. The prairies, I actually did live there for a while, for about 7 years with my family. And it's all about wheat, beef, canola production. You may have heard in the news today that China has actually imposed some restrictions on canola trades versus Canada. It's a big deal. Canola, if you didn't know, canola actually was invented in Canada. There is a story about the name itself, canola, coming from Canada oil, canola. That's It's a word that came up of out of Winnipeg in Manitoba, which is in the middle of the country. And so it's very commodity driven. The prairies really feeds the world. They do export a lot of food to the world for sure. British Columbia is a smaller part of it's on the west coast, and it's a very diverse economy. So they have a wine industry. It is the one province where you have the most wineries per capita in Canada. There's a lot of organic farming there. It's very uh, not fractured, but there are so many factions within the agri-food sector in British Columbia. It's actually quite amazing, and they do trade a lot with states like Washington and California as well. So it's a province that does very well. And finally, the Northern Territories. If you look at the map, there's the north. There's very few people who live in the north, but they do rely a lot on imports, obviously, because of frigid conditions to grow food. Um, so some of the contemporary food culture that we see in Canada, again, those are probably similar to America. The farm to table movement, that's certainly a movement that you see in many places around the country. The growth of farmers markets, we are seeing more farmers markets because people want to get closer to the source as much as possible. Although over the last couple of years, things have slowed down because of food inflation. Same in the US. I read headlines in the US. Of course, with farmers markets, prices tend to be higher than usual. So it really has pushed consumers away from some of these outlets. The whole issue of traceability and sustainable food sources are becoming more predominant as well when it comes to the farm to table movement. The use of technology, the role of agri-tech, of course, yields are, I mean, agriculture in Canada is becoming more and more efficient, productive as well. It's amazing. And the biotechnologies are really predominant in Canada. They are embraced. Of course, the way we define novel foods in Canada is the same as in the US. So, from a regulatory perspective, there are clear synergies between the two nations, just because we're so intertwined from an economic perspective that we have to align a lot of the policies together. Influence of global trade, of course. Canada trade with the rest of the world. We actually have many trade agreements. We have a trade agreement, of course, with the U.S. and Mexico. We also have a trade agreement with the Asian Pacific market. We also have a trade agreement with Europe, excluding now the United Kingdom, and we are negotiating a trade deal with the United Kingdom after Brexit. That's a work in progress. But what's unique about Canada is that we're arguably the only nation in the world involved with three major continental trade deals. So Europe, North America, and Asia as well. So which really makes Canada a unique place because of that. So that's another thing that is unique to Canada. And lastly, consumer preferences. So the plant-based movement, of course, is real in Canada, especially with dairy alternatives, for example. On the meat side, we've seen more investments. There's more traction. These products, we're seeing more growth in those areas. For reasons really will vary. So people may decide to eat more plant-based. Well, plant-based is not a term that I actually like to use. I prefer vegetable protein versus animal protein. With vegetable protein, typically consumers opt for vegetable proteins because of health reasons. Because it doesn't mean that it's actually the case, but for health reasons, the environment, and of course sometimes the price. The price is actually uh, better if you compare, say, with beef, because beef has become really expensive even in Canada. I know in the US it's the same, but typically food prices in Canada are a little higher than in the US because of the fact that we don't have as much competition. Our population is not as dense, and of course, we live in one of the largest countries in the world with only 41 million people. So distribution costs are much higher. Just in the Atlantic, for example, the Atlantic actually will be as big as the state of Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, New York, and probably Pennsylvania combined. And you only have 3 million people there. So if you can imagine, it does cost a lot of money to service all of that market. And so where I live here in Halifax, food prices are pretty darn high. And because when I went to Florida, when we go to Maine or other places, prices tend to be a lot lower in general, even with the conversion between Canadian and American dollars. And so in general, I would say that in Canada, we are seeing trends that are very similar to the US, but there is some resistance towards things like, for example, cellular agriculture with cultivated meats, for example. So it is not approved in Canada versus the US. It is approved in the US. But we know that some states in the US are pushing back. They are banning cellular agriculture. In Canada, there hasn't been one request yet, which is interesting. So Health Canada is starting to look into it, but I think it's going to take a while before Health Canada decides anything on it. And that's typically, from a regulatory perspective, I would say it's very typical in Canada to wait a little bit and see what the US does, and then basically follow suit. So my guess is that in Canada, cellular agriculture or cultivated meats, for example, will be accepted eventually, but now it's not the case. Food security and affordability. Obviously, there are major differences in terms of prices. There's urban Canada and rural Canada, and in rural areas, there's just little competition, and you typically expect to pay a little bit more than usual. And of course, there's a lot of pressure in Canada on put on politicians to address some of these issues, of course. And immigration, of course, has always favored urban centers. But more and more, we're seeing communities actually where our government, I would say, probably over the last decade or so, has really pushed immigrants to consider rural areas, and that really has changed many communities, in my view, for the better. Just because it makes rural economies more vibrant, and frankly, they need population growth for their economies. Climate change is a reality, of course, but we've been able to adapt quite a bit. In fact, if you look at Canada's agricultural output over the last 2 decades or so, I mean, we're constantly doing better, and so because our farmers anyways, and our manufacturers have been able to cope with climate change in general, which in a very efficient way, which really has helped everyone. And but the push right now, I'd say over the last 7 to 8 years, is indigenous food sovereignty. So you're seeing more communities, First Nation communities, invest in agri-food, in manufacturing, especially. Just recently, there's a major company called Clearwater that was actually just sold to First Nations for about $1 billion Canadian, and it was sold to Constellation Brands out west and the Mi'kmaq people here, which is really interesting. So basically, they bought one of the largest seafood firms in the world, and now they're playing a part in food distribution and trades, which is interesting. So that deal happened, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, and we can actually see some of the changes as a result of this change. So they're basically taking ownership of food systems more and more than what we saw in the past. So Canada versus U.S. Of course, we share a lot of commodities. Sometimes we'll grow mustard seeds, which is a huge export for us, and we sell it to the U.S. when we buy it back in a bottle 10 times the price. And so if you take a hamburger in Canada, I would say that a lot of it was grown in Canada, but a lot of it was processed in the US as well. And so you can feel that both economies really rely on each other, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, despite the politics, despite the rhetoric, the protectionism, the posturing. I don't think that's going to change because it's just so convenient for everyone that it really impossible to break that up. And of course, the U.S. will continue to nurture different relationships with other trading partners. Is the same for us as well. So in consumer behavior, I don't see really much of a difference, to be honest. When you go to America, I would say the only major difference is food service. So in Canada, about 39%. So if you take a family, an average family, 39% of that family's budget will be devoted to food consumed outside the home. So we don't go out as much as Americans. Americans, I believe it's north of 50. So, and when you go to the US, you can clearly see that restaurants play a much larger role. So food service in Canada is not as dominant as in the US. Even though Burger King, Tim Hortons are Canadian companies now because the head office is in Toronto. I would say that Canadians tend to not go out as much as Americans, and that really changes the way that people feed themselves, obviously, and how much they actually spend on food. They are distinct regional differences when it comes to Canada, and I always compare like the French influence because of Quebec is similar to what you find in the U.S. with the Spanish and Mexican influence down south, I would say, and across the country. The French influence coming from Quebec is across the board because it is part of the government. It is part of the fact that there is this recognition. There are two official languages in Canada, French and English, and that really influences everything else. And of course, the other big difference is our marketing boards and protectionism. I would say that Canada is and this is really, I'm being very critical towards my own country here. Uh, Canada, when you look at policies, is not necessarily trade focused, it's more trade reliant. And so we have over 120 marketing boards, and we have supply management, which is part of that group. And supply management is a very restrictive regime. So you have a quota system in Canada for poultry, eggs, and dairy. So if you want to commercially sell milk, eggs, or chicken or turkey, you have to own quotas. And there are about $30 billion worth of quotas. If you do not have a quota or quotas, you cannot sell. Okay. And boards will set appropriate prices for processors to pay. So every now and then, depending of the commodity, depending where they are, they'll look at the cost to produce, and they'll actually set a price to make sure that farmers get a fair price for that product. So this is really it was influenced by the Canadian school of thought in economics. So it's a very highly organized system. Some people would say it looks more like China, which is kind of true. It's very highly organized and centralized, but it's been around for more than 50 years now, and it works for farmers. I'm not sure it works for the rest of the economy, but it works for farmers. They get a fair price, and they do fairly well within that regime. The challenge with that system is that it doesn't really allow for groups to innovate, and whether or not it serves consumers well is questionable, because prices are actually typically much higher. If you actually come to Canada and look at cheese prices, yogurt prices, milk prices, you'll actually find that prices here are much higher than in the US, and a lot of it has to do with the supply management regime that we have. So it's very restrictive, and so it's been debated for a very long time, but politically people involved in that regime are incredibly influential. So it's very hard for politicians to make it a political football. The only way to actually bring changes to the regime would be to see an external politicians question or challenge the regime, like Donald Trump did when he became president. He actually became the change agent for supply management as an external president of the United States, and that forced Canada to actually make some changes, making some concessions to allow more products from the U.S. Now, whether or not it actually work is questionable, because some of the stuff that has happened, transpired since, is incredibly difficult to manage. But really, it's a very difficult regime to eliminate. Our food guide compared to yours, I wanted to kind of point or at least show to you what the food guide is. The food guide in Canada is the most read government document that we have in Canada after tax forms. Of course, you have tax forms, and then you have the food guide. The food guide is being institutionalized. The one that you see right now is 5 years old. It is typically revised every 5-6 years. So we're actually in the middle of our revision right now. But the food guide that we have now is pretty simple, but yet nutritionally, I would say, ambitious, and perhaps somewhat even disconnected from what we do in Canada. So so basically, the plate or the diet is separated into three. You have fibers, you have grains, and then you have proteins, essentially. So the vegetable and fruits, that's half of your diet. So half of your diet in Canada, you should actually eat fruits and vegetables. The problem is that a lot of these products we don't grow all year round, and so we have to import from abroad. So we're at the mercy of the Canadian dollar, of course, and so the plate is actually somewhat disconnected with what we actually grow in Canada. Unfortunately, we do grow some of the stuff there, but not all of it, or at least we don't grow these commodities efficiently. So the food guide is basically this: you got fibers, you have grains, and you have proteins. So a quarter, and half. So with proteins, the intent of Health Canada, which is similar to what you guys have with the FDA, the approach is very much about vegetable proteins. In fact, there's some meat there, but it's really the emphasis when you read the guide. The emphasis is very much about about vegetable protein in general, and then you have grains at the bottom as well. So some fun facts for you. So craft dinner maybe I'll actually use this. So craft dinner basically is a very popular dish in Canada. In fact, um, the consumption of KD in Canada is the highest in the world per capita. So it's a really very popular. I don't know what's going on with KD in Canada, but it's incredibly popular, and people just enjoy KD in general. Uh, Also, other things that we actually have in Canada that is unique is are these products. So starting with ketchup, uh, chips that are flavored as ketchup, and these ketchup chips are actually quite popular, which is unique. You can't find that in America. Maybe you can find some in America, but it's a very popular chip. Coffee Crisp is a bar by Nestle that is only sold in Canada, very popular as well. And of course, out of Chatham, Ontario, Canada, the Hawaiian pizza with pineapple and ham, invented in Canada. That is our contribution to the world, our pride and joy. And of course, when you go to Italy and you explain that Canada actually decided to add pineapple and ham to their invention. They don't necessarily appreciate that, but because we don't even grow pineapples in Canada. So, anyways, that's kind of a funny story, but it was actually invented in Canada. The Bloody Caesar also was invented in Canada. That's another drink. And of course, all of these things, I think the common denominator for all of these things is comfort, essentially, and what really what they represent. So it's about fun, comfort. It's about joy. It's not necessarily about health. Certainly not about health. And speaking of not healthy, poutine. I don't know if you see the cover of my book called Poutine Nation. It came out a couple of years ago. I actually wrote a book, the book about poutine, and people have always wondered what's the history of poutine. Why was it invented? And I was actually on a plane going somewhere. I can't remember, and I actually am originally from the region where it was actually invented, and nobody really wrote a book about why this really disgusting, heavy, unhealthy meal was invented in rural Quebec. And so basically, I started to do some research to find more about um, cheese curds, which is really one of the main ingredients to poutine. So it's basically gravy, cheese curds, and fries put together. So as you can imagine, with the cheese melting because of the heat of the fries and the gravy, that's kind of what poutine is. And poutine basically is actually from an English expression called put in. The first person who actually went into a restaurant and asked the restaurant operator to say, "Listen, I'm in a hurry. Please put," because they were selling cheese separate from the fries. They said, "Why don't you put the cheese in the fries? Put in," and that's kind of one of the uh, well, it's one story because I was never able to find out beyond reasonable doubt why it was called poutine, but that's one of the legends, and it's the most dominating legend out there. So poutine, which is coming from a French part of Canada, it comes from someone who was speaking in English, asking a French person to actually put put cheese on fries, which I thought was interesting. But generally speaking, this dish is 60 years old this year. It was invented in 1964 in a city called Drummondville, and it was actually invented by a saucier, a person, an expert in sauces, and basically decided to sell this dish with the three ingredients on his menu for the first time. Of course, in 1957, that's when cheese curds came along, and they were basically around for a while, but that's when for the first time we mixed fries with cheese curds, but they called it poutine, but they never actually sold it with the gravy. It was later in 1964 that the gravy came along with the cheese and the fries. And today, so my book talks about the history of poutine and talks about the politics at the time. In those days, in the 1950s and 60s, if you know a bit about the history of Quebec in particular, the church was really dominating politics. It was dominating everyone's aspects of life, really, and you couldn't really say your opinion. You couldn't really say. They call it the Grand Noirceur, the big black era where people couldn't express their opinions in 1950s and 60s, and this dish actually came out during that era. And of course, it came from rural Quebec, and of course, later it reached big cities. Uh, it reached Quebec City for the first time. That was the first big city where they saw poutine, and it became so popular in the 60s and 70s that franchises like McDonald's and Burger King in the 80s asked a special permission from head office to sell poutine in their restaurants in Canada in that area. Harvey's did the same thing, Burger King, McDonald's, and then the rest was history. Basically, it spread across the country and, of course, around the world. And now today, 60 years later, you can actually easily find poutine uh, around the world. Actually, the second part of my book is about this pilgrimage, this poutine pilgrimage. Every time I actually landed somewhere, I just basically went out and asked the concierge or someone, "Why can I get poutine?" And it was always so I had poutine in Cleveland, New Orleans in the U.S., in in Mexico City, Shanghai, China, also in Brisbane, Australia, in Lille, France, and Budapest in Hungary. So that's when I realized, my goodness, it's a globalized dish. It's probably the most globalized dish now that people know, and it's a Canadian dish. So there you go. You know more about poutine today, and for students, that's really important. And finally, I would say there are two other dishes that may actually be well known to you. Smoked meat, which was invented in Montreal, along with the Montreal bagel, of course. That dish actually is now incredibly popular. So whenever there's a hockey bet going on between, say, Buffalo and Montreal, or Montreal and New York or something, there's always smoked meat involved or poutine involved. But it's a very popular. It's basically beef smoked, and it's mixed typically with rye bread and mustard, which is actually pretty good. I wouldn't say that it is as popular as poutine now, but it is quite popular. And the last one is shepherd's pie. I would say that shepherd's pie is really one of the most popular dishes that we have in Canada. That's a mixture of beef, of ground beef, corn, and potatoes. And that was, I think it was invented in 1800s or something like that. And in French, it's called pâté chinois, Chinese pie. Okay, I don't know why it's called Chinese pie, but essentially, all of these dishes, what they have in common, it's about it. They're all calorie rich. They're all dense food, and it's all about surviving the winter, harsh weather. There's not a salad. You'll never see a salad invented in Canada because of our weather, but you can tell that really Canadians are always after something that tastes good, that's comfort, that's comforting during the winter months, essentially. Uh, I also have, as mentioned, I also have a podcast called The Food Professor. It's on Spotify and Apple podcasts. If you're interested in knowing more about the Canadian agri-food economy. We have guests all the time. It's actually a well listened to podcast. We do have a lot of fun. My co-producer, Michael LeBlanc, and myself. It's a weekly show. And so we release our episode every Thursday. And so on that note, I will stop here. I know we have some time for a Q&A. I'm hoping that I'll be able to hear you. There was some echo going on there, but hopefully I'll be able to hear your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
So if you have questions, I'm going to pass the mic around because we are Zooming this and also recording it.
When you were talking about cellular agriculture, is that like lab grown meat?
Yes. I'm not sure how you call it in America, but that's basically what it is, and it's a fascinating technology. It was approved in the U.S. I believe it was last year, but we know that Florida, um, Alabama, and Alabama, I think, have banned these products from entering the food chain, and I think Texas is thinking about it as well. So yeah, it's a controversial topic for sure. We are about to approve in Canada cloned clone meat. It's coming, and it's already actually creating a bit of a problem with the farming community here in Canada. We are expecting that to happen sometime this fall.
What Canadian desserts would you suggest would be most common?
Nanaimo bars, actually. Yeah, Thank you for asking, actually. So Nanaimo bars, I don't have a picture of a Nanaimo bar, but it's incredibly sweet. Incredibly sweet, I would say that. So there's chocolate, fudge. It looks like a piece of fudge essentially, but with 3 colors and nuts in them. So Nanaimo bars were invented in Nanaimo, British Columbia, many years ago, but it's probably, I would say, the most well-known Canadian dessert.
But I wanted to ask you about Tim Hortons, the fast food chain, coffee and donuts, why it is so successful. We're even seeing it in the United States. You know, it's in New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio, but there's even one that just opened in June in the Kansas City area in Blue Springs, Tim Hortons. What do you think is responsible for the success of Tim Hortons?
Well, it's certainly very successful in Canada, and in America, I mean, the success was mixed depending on where you went. Since it's been bought by 3G Capital and Warren Buffett many years ago now, things have changed. I think they're being able to optimize their operations, making franchises more successful. But I would say in Canada, the success has been around nostalgia. Tim Hortons was a hockey player and played for Buffalo, and that's probably why it brought people to go to Tim Hortons. And they just they deployed very quickly. The other thing that you may want to know about Canada is that Canadians were always drinking coffee at home. So Tim Hortons got people to drink coffee outside the home. It was really the first one to do that. So Starbucks often talks about the third place between home and work. Well, Tim Hortons did that many years ago in Canada. And so obviously in the US, there's way more competition, which is why perhaps it struggled to penetrate the market, but it's starting, I think, to do very well because of the help they get from other divisions within RBI, which is Popeyes and Burger King. They're all owned by the same conglomerate, which is RBI Restaurants International.
Dr. Charlebois, I wonder if you've noticed exports in fish, increase in exports in fish, seafood from your part of Canada.
Well, it varies every year. It depends on what species you're looking at. Like, for example, this year, lobster, it was a terrible season for lobster for obvious reasons because of the economy. Consumers are around the world are way more frugal because of inflation, and that tends to hurt lobster and crab in particular. And those are two very important products in our economy. So we have exported less some of these products. And I'm actually meeting with the Seafood Alliance in a couple of weeks, but they weren't good years. For other fish, it's been better, like salmon. Salmon is really a solid commodity, typically coming from Canada. But there are major variations from one season to another, for sure.
Well, that's an hour of very interesting information. I noticed your book on poutine. Is that available in English as well, or is it French only?
I'm working on it.
Oh, okay.
I'm working
Okay.
on it. Yeah, I'm right. I'm right because I need to make some adjustments. That's why. So I'm working on it for sure. But Poutine Nation is only available in French, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to its coming out in English, unless anyone here is bilingual. Dr. Charlebois, thank you for your time. What a fantastic presentation.
And I want to thank your university for dedicating so much time to our country. It's always nice to see our neighbors look and study our country. It's great. And if you're ever in Canada, let us know, or let me know. If you're in the Atlantic or Halifax, please let me know. I'll give you a treat and treat you with some good poutine lobster.
We'll have to take advantage of that. Thanks again, Dr. Charlebois.
Take care. Bye-bye.